Okay, so yeah, so it's 1 o'clock. We got about 20 people in here, so let's get started today. So friends, yeah, so this is our second workshop series of, it's basically just a common questions workshop. So if you have questions during the this workshop, please fire them in the Q&A panel. I'll do my best to get back to you. If there's questions I can't answer, please send me an email. My email is in the it's just in the chat panel right now. Yeah, and what I'm going to do is, because this first workshop, the series that we did in June, was so successful, I actually had a bunch of questions left over that I wasn't able to get to. So I'm going to address those questions today, and I'm going to try to do my best to address any questions that you have during this workshop as I'm going through it. So let me know what those are, and we'll continue. So I'm going to hide my face. I'm going to hide my face now. There we go. Okay, so you should be able to see my ACDSee Photo Studio Ultimate open, and you can hear me. Great. So first question is from Wilbert. Wilbert asks, I'm going to build a new desktop in a couple months. How do I transfer my ACDSee license to my new computer? Provided you, there shouldn't be any issue to that whatsoever, Wilbert. But I would double check with our support team on that in that regard. There are some sort of like rulings to licenses, but generally the number of installs per license is forgiving for these sort of things. I would just double check with support. That's more of a support question than really a workshop question that I can answer, but I don't anticipate you will have that many issues with that. So, okay. Peter asks, I'm interested in how different people have different workflows. Could you share yours with us, please? Sure. Actually, one of the resources that are really good, so I'm not a photographer. I'm an enthusiast, but not a photographer. And one of the things that's really valuable is actually, I'm going to get you, we just hired a friend of ACDSee's. His name is Alec Watson, and he's a photographer. He does a lot of photography for like fashion magazines and that sort of thing. He does lots of work with models and model photography. So he has a really interesting workflow. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to direct you to our YouTube channel, because you can watch him over the course of 2 courses, essentially, go through what he views as his best practices for his workflow as he's a photographer. You know, so at some point I would double check that our YouTube channel and talk about that a little bit in greater depth. For myself, I can talk a little bit about certain workflows. They'll come up in this workshop themselves, but for me, I come from a graphic design background, not a photography background. So a lot of my sort of workflows and tools and the things that I use are more within the edit functionality, more within sort of the management functionality than actually through the process of going and you know, essentially being a photographer. So I'm not working with massive amounts of files. I'm working with multi-layered files. I'm working, anyway, you'll see. But for sure, if you're looking for a photography workflow, there's no better resource than what I just linked you to, which is of course that course series on our YouTube channel. So hopefully that answers your question, Peter, but we'll talk a little bit more about the workflow as we go through. So one of the first questions that I wanted to address that was from the previous workshop, one that we sort of covered it a little bit last time, but I want to cover it again, and that's face detection is a big aspect of our Photo Studio Ultimate 2019 line. And so face detection is like sort of a bit of misunderstood as a tool in ACDSee Ultimate. So let's talk a little bit more about what it does and how to use it effectively. So face detection is pretty much what it sounds like. So face detection is a facial detection, finding faces, and recognition software, or recognition tool rather. And that it is designed for looking at your collection of photos on your hard drive and sort of in the background passively working to identify what part of an image is a face. And then it provides you the tools and the means to go through and sort of like add recognition information to that to your database, which you can reference for future photos. So what does that mean? Well, I've opened up manage mode. Here's a whack of photos. What we're going to do is we're going to actually go into view mode, and we're going to talk about how to sort of turn on facial recognition and identification. But I guess one of the first things I should do is, just because I might already have some information stored in here, well, you know what? We'll deal with that when it comes up. Actually, it's more fun. So, so here I am. I'm just going to go into view mode. So face detection and recognition is sort of controlled in view mode. So I'll select a photo, and I'm just going to bring it open in view mode. And then my photo will come up, and you'll notice that I've already turned face detection on. So it's already live up and up. Face detection is managed in the bottom section here, the bottom sort of panel here. So to turn face detection on, you would click this button right here, which is the show face outlines. So again, like I said, you know, when you turn on ACDSee FOSU Ultimate, the process here already is to sort of check what images you have on your computer and sort of assign in the background which of these images contain face data. So which of these images contain people. Anyway, so once it's established that information, in this case, it's fairly obvious that our character Aaron here has a face. Ta-da. And then we would go through the process of being able to edit that information once we've detected a face. So to edit, you would click on the face tool that's to the left of the scroll tool here. And the face tool allows you to edit the face outlines themselves and also add names. So if I click this, you'll notice that the bounding box can be enlarged. And in addition to that, too, it also gives you the ability to change the name or add a name in the case of if you've never used it before. So we have our character here, and obviously we've named him Aaron. Now, if we were to go through, I'm going to go through our little section of images here, and we're going to double check to see which we've categorized as Aaron based on this face recognition. But before I do this, though, I'm just going to have a quick look at like who right now, what ACDSee names I have already sort of preloaded, pre-existed in this collection. So to do that, I want to manage people. So I'm going to go to my tools panel, I believe, and I'm going to go to manage people. And this is going to tell me just already whom I have entered into my database in regards to people. So it turns out I have a bunch added already. So I have Aaron, as you can see just in front of myself here. You have Ashley, Brooke, Carol, Dale, Haley, Mike, Sarah, and Tina. So what we can do is we can also go about deleting these at any point. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to delete all of these names with the exception of probably Aaron here. So we can go through the process of sort of renaming people. So let's highlight all these people. And I'm just going to go about deleting them by removing the selected persons here. So I'm just going to click that. It says, are you sure you want to remove this selected people? Okay, beautiful. I'm going to close. I do believe I might have to restart for these things to be finalized, but let's just double check here. Okay, no, it's done it right now, so I don't need to redo that. Let's make sure that, yeah, so I believe I am correct in that case. Okay, so the only person that we have in our repertoire, our database of names that we've assigned right now is just Aaron. It's just Aaron. So if I go to another image with different saturation that looks like Aaron, it's going to determine that there are, oh, let me refresh that. Aaron, interesting. So why doesn't it recognize this? redetect faces. Okay, so that's slightly, oh, that might be because the photo is enlarged. Okay, so anyway, so what I just did there is I just went through the process of redetecting a face, but I believe I've since sort of done something to that file that would make it difficult for that. Anyway, but if you go through the process of going through your tools here, you can redetect people through that. So if you, for example, have removed a name or you've sort of removed a bounding box, you can. This is more important too when you have multiple people in an image. Which will come up. So anyway, but it appears as though obviously Aaron is detected in this image, he's detected in another image. So we have like Aaron being stored in the database, and also it's seemingly understanding who this is on these images. So let's just go through and we're going to assign some names to people in our images here. And we're going to see how well, how well it does it at sort of recording that information and applying it to other images. And if you have any questions, just remember to add them to the Q&A panel. So if we go add like, okay, let's just call her Sarah and let's call her Tina. Okay, let's see if it recognizes any of them. So this is an interesting case too, because there's actually not a lot of facial data right here because this person's face is mostly in profile. So when you go to an image where their face is mostly up front, you're getting a lot of facial data. It's not recognizing this person. But because we have Tina in our database, we can add her name or start to add her name here and it'll come up. So we're gonna go ahead and add it right there. And then it'll recognize it for an image where she's, this in this case is slightly in profile, slightly straight on, but it's very obvious that there's more facial data in this image than there is in that image. Now that being said, it also looks like we have 3 detected faces here, but our 4th detected face is very blurry and it's also in the foreground and it's out of focus. So this is the person who is not being detected in this image at all. If we wanted to add this person, we could go ahead and add a new bounding box, which in this case is only the 4th. But there's so little facial information within this that it would be pretty impossible for it to detect anyone who looks like this. So I'm just going to remove that. But anyway, as we go through, so it appears as though we already have gone through the process. We're detecting Tina. This is good. Let's go and add, what are we going to call you? Let's add you, right, I think we'll call you Carol. And so if we go through and it should be able to detect this is in fact Carol, this is also Carol, this is Carol, even though there's a substantial differentiation and saturation with these images. We'll call this gentleman Dale. And so Dale is recognized in this photo, obviously. He's also recognized in this photo. He's recognized in this photo. He should be not necessarily recognized in this photo, but if we add him using the panel here, we should be able to add that. Yeah. So you can go through and add your sort of different characters through, and the more information, the more you provide face detection. So obviously, if you have a bunch of images of, like we just did there with Dale, and one of them was undetected, well, I'm providing them a more range to detect a face with whenever we go in and we add this information. So here we have our character Haley, and we're viewing her face and all of this. And so we have this repertoire of names now and faces that exist, which we can go back to manage people to view at any point. So this is sort of the process of adding this information, of going in and categorizing and applying this information to these people. But okay, Adam, that's great. But how is this useful from a standpoint of like searching through my collections to view this information? Well, that's sort of the next point of this conversation. And if we go to manage mode, so this is our sort of collection of just face photos in general. But if we were to sort of navigate away from this, I'm going to go back to my previous folder. Pardon me. Whatever, I'm in a different folder. And I want to bring up these images. I want to sort of navigate to my images of Dale, for example. I would go to the catalog function. So the catalog function is at the top left-hand corner. And there's an entire section devoted to people. So these are the peoples that we have managed within our manage panel. And you'll notice that Aaron, Carol, Dale, Haley, and Sarah and Tina are all sort of there living in that. So we can search for these people at any point. So if I wanted to bring up my photos of Aaron, or if I wanted to bring up my photos of Carol or Dale, they all exist within this area, and we can sort of navigate to them really quickly. Now, this is useful from a standpoint of like being able to quickly go in and say, okay, well, I want to look for all my photos of Dale that I can find. And I also want to revisit perhaps, I want to, star them. So I'll go through and rate these images or whatever, so that I can sort of, I know that I can also, so if I said, oh, well, I really like this photo of Dale, let's rate this image of, let's say rate this image out of 5. And I wasn't so keen on this photo of Dale, so I'm going to rate this photo as a 4. Then we could sort of mix and match the cataloging in this case. So we're looking for an image of Dale. Great. So we have all of our images there. And then, well, what if I was also looking for an image of Dale that was a 5? So then now it knows based on these 2 criteria, the first criteria, of course, being the people criteria, and the second criteria, of course, being the rating of 5. So now we've homogenized those things, and now we're only displaying, even though we're not viewing a singular folder, we are displaying through our entire repertoire of photos, all of the photos of Dale that are rated out of 5. What else? So the other thing too is you can, I guess it's always, useful pointing out, but you can actually also quick search for any person. So if we wanted to quick search for Aaron, for example, we could use the quick search bar that's up on the top right here, and it would navigate to our photos. So this is how we sort of go through the process of assigning values, assigning names to people, and then going through the process of like culling or finding or rating and all of these things. So it provides a platform for us to assign these values, but also pull them at any point. Now, I'm just trying to think if there's anything I've forgotten about facial recognition that's also useful. The manage people section itself, if you wanted to rename a subject, or if you had multiple subjects in an image, so if we go back to our face detection folder, in this case we have multiple people in an image. If we wanted to rename this subject, so if we wanted to name her Rebecca, I believe what you'll find is that Tina will still be under the manage people section. So if you said, okay, well, I made a mistake, Tina is actually Rebecca, well, I could go through and then I could erase Tina from this manage people section. And it might do well enough given the criteria or given sort of the facial detection that you've provided, that it can go through and it can sort of reassign people as Rebecca, but you might also have to re-enter that information. So we could go and we could delete Tina and use Rebecca in this case. So there's a lot going on here. But the easiest thing to remember, obviously, is that whenever you add new photos to your system, so you add it to whatever hard drive you're using, whatever you've assigned, you're going to go through and it's going to start to, when you open the program, and it's going to start checking these photos in the background for faces. It's going to detect these faces. And then you can go through the process of naming them. Yeah. Obviously, that's sort of just an overlook of how one would use facial detection. So let's have a look at some of the questions, because some of these are probably pertinent to face detection, and then we'll go on to our next question here. Terry says, I'm new to ACDSee. I noticed that you marked several faces at once. How did you do that? What keys did you use? Several faces at once. Well, when they pop up here, you can sort of go through and use these active boxes to name so if we wanted to name this guy like Mike, for example, it would then be applied. You just hit enter, and it would add that person to the repertoire. But the way in this case where you add or you can edit these names is by using this face tool, and you can turn it on or off depending on sort of whether or not you want to edit those photos at that time. When would you use redetect faces and would you use rerun recognition? Okay, so let's say that I've closed Rebecca and I didn't want to personally or manually enter a new box to add them to my list. And you notice that when I did that, let's actually remove all three of these, or actually let's remove Sarah and Rebecca here. If I've removed these faces and I didn't want to personally manually draw these new bounding boxes, which can be a good process, I could also go through the process of, I believe, redetecting faces for the whole image. And in this case, it's been pretty good. It recognizes this face. I might have to do a restart or manually enter another face. It seems like this one was forgotten, but this one was definitely entered. So there might be a process in which you have actually several people in an image. And if that is the case, it might be faster to use the redetect faces than to manually enter those people's faces just using the control bounding boxes. And then rerun recognition. Oops. Rerun recognition, I'm less clear on. I think the purpose of rerun recognition would be if you've since added a whole group of images to your hard drive or to a specific folder or something like that, then rerun recognition will go through the process of detecting what new files have been added. Remove faces is just a fast way of removing all of the faces that are in an image. So hopefully that answers your question. Carl asked, you came up with an interesting scenario. If you face detect on a zoomed picture, does it retain the correct face box and name when unzoomed? Yeah, that came up earlier, I guess, when we were looking at that one photo of Aaron. Let's take a look at it. This might just be one of those things where it's yeah, so this case, this photo is zoomed by 55% versus the original, which is actually also zoomed by 55%. Let's just close this image. Maybe let's go to 100% zoom, and then let's go through the process of maybe redetecting faces and see what happens. Yeah, so this one is an unusual one. I'm not sure why it's coming in small. This might be some sort of small bug in relation to it. But in this case, it looks like we'd have to reset the values on this. I'm just a bit unclear in this case. It's possible that it only is viewing this. Yeah, oh, this is actually maybe exactly what's going on here. Let me try this one more time. Let's zoom. Let's just go 1-to-1 ratio. Yeah, 55. I bet you anything that his face color is saturated so similarly to that of the background that in this image, it's only detecting the mouth area because it only recognizes that as what is closest to a face. Versus if we're looking at the original image, it's possible that this is having an easier time with the face because there's more contrast in the image. Let's redetect again. I bet you that is what's going on. It might come down to simply, in this case, a change of the color of this person's skin in this correlation to the background that is providing a challenge for the face detection software. Obviously, one of the big things about face detection is that it's useful for all people of different skin types. Like that's going to be the case, but it's still going to have challenge and struggle issues when you have an image that has a lot of lack of contrast that is occurring here. Obviously, high contrast between that of his hat and the background, but very low contrast between that of his face itself and that of the orange background. This is really a bad example of some saturation that in this image. It's just a bad image to begin with. But in this case, it didn't struggle in the same way that these two images did. So my guess is that for this case, it's probably hugely related to the background color itself. So that is that guy. I don't think it has anything to do with zooming per se, but necessarily the background color. Can you use facial detection to find photos with no faces present? No, I don't believe you can. There might be some corner case scenarios when just due to the way that the face detection was coded, that it might identify something as a face, like for example, a mannequin. But I think that that would be a very low percentage. Yeah, so, okay. So that is sort of like a crib notes on the old face detection. So let's jump into the next. The question actually relates to what we've been talking about. And that question came up in our previous video, and that is the database the same as the catalog? So the database in ACDSee is an important thing to be aware about, depending on whether or not you are going to run through the process of caring about the information that you apply to the database. So in ACDSee, there's a lot of things that are applied to the database. Let's jump back into manage mode to talk about some of these. So I'm going to go back into my photos folder. So the database itself cares about ratings. So things like this guy right here, this is a rating. It cares about labels. These are labels. It cares about tagging images or untagged images. It cares about images that have been added to a particular category or keyword. So if we had added in the properties panel here a category or keyword to our image, these are qualities that the database cares about. The database also cares about what we just talked about, which is face detection. So face detection is not applied to an image's metadata. It's actually applied to ACDSee's database. So things like face information is sent to the database. Another thing that the database cares about, which is a simple and silly one, is thumbnails. So what I'm viewing right now in ACDSee, in the manage mode section of this sort of folder, I'm viewing a series of thumbnails. Thumbnails are, of course, these small images. So the database cares about these thumbnails. What the database does not care about at all is the images themselves. It doesn't move the images into a specific database. We're just caring about these qualities: keywords, ratings, labels, tags, faces, and thumbnails. So let's go back to the original question. So the question is the database the same as a catalog? No, they're not the same. The database is where cataloging information is stored. So later on in this video, we'll talk about sort of the importance of like how to pull and how to like optimize and look at databases. But just from the purpose of what is contained in a database, now you know. Those are the elements that are contained within a database, which include cataloging information. But the catalog, or the process of me going about rating or whatever, adding keywords, etc., to this image, is not the same as a database. So, so now a little bit more about databases. So what are they? So basically, if you have ACDSee 2019 installed on your computer, ACDSee Photo Studio 2019, and you wanted to maintain these things, you're like, hey, I have all these ratings, I have all these keywords, I have all these labels, and I like them. When I install the next version of the product, I want to make sure that that information is held onto. I want to make sure that that information I have access to when I go to the next product. So then what you'd go through the process of doing is saving a database, and then going through the process of importing your database when you get to the next software. So that's a little bit about databases. Carl asked, I would suggest this should be an enhancement where the box went set. Yes, absolutely. Carl also asked, please run through how audio files associated with pictures work. Not sure I know what you mean. This might be a question I'll have to answer over email. I do believe in ACDSee you can run through the management function. You can run audio files. They come up just like any other file can, and you can also view video files as well. but I'm less clear on what you mean in regards to that. So, okay, so the next question has, so every image I view in ACD, so this was a question from the previous video. Every image I view in ACDSee winds up in the database. So as we just outlined, that's actually not true. The thumbnails are a component of the database, but your images themselves are not. So he would go on to ask, but not the catalog unless I import it, right? Okay, so he wants to know, am I able to take this cataloging information and how do I move that to my next, to the next series of ACDSee Photo Studio Ultimate 2020? And that's, of course, we go through the process of, so let's save and sort of go through the process of understanding how to import databases. Okay, so you can refer to a database by file database. So all this really does is allow you to open or make new databases. When you start using ACDSee Photo Studio Ultimate 2019, regardless of whether or not you wanted a database is created for you, okay? So when you go to open it for the first time, your original database, whatever, is going to be set to default or something like that. In this case, I'm actually looking at it right there. So I'm just going to open up my database. So it's located in the folder tree. So in your computer, it's on ACD systems, under local, catalog, whatever. So there's that tree itself. And then you'll notice that my database is titled just default.database bin. So that's the file right there. So that's the database that was created when I started this software. And that's the one that I would reference if I wanted to open or if I want to go through the process of importing a database. Alternatively, too, I can also at any point create a new database. And that would go through the process of, I would name it, and then it would place it in that same folder structure. In this case, it's in app data, local, ACD systems, catalog, and then ultimate. Okay, so if at any point we're like, okay, well, I actually wanted to create a separate database or reference an old database, that would be how we go through the process of referencing a database that we're currently using for this product. Now, that's great, Adam, but there's some more going on here, right? There's much more going on here. So when I go to ACDSee Photo Studio 2020, okay? When I go to the next version of the product, there's two things I'm going to want to do. The first is when I install my product, and I really want that database so that I get all those ratings, keywords, labels, etc. I go through the process of converting an old database. So I'm converting my Ultimate 2019 database to my 2020 database. I would use the database conversion wizard, and that would basically take that old database and make it relevant for the new product. And then I would simply go through the database function to import that database. So now I want to use that database actively. And so that would how I would go through that process. Now, there's a question that came up, is going to actually come up much later. And that question is, okay, great, Adam, but what happens if I've moved files or folders since I've created my, that database? Excuse me. And that is a great question because a database does care about the folder structure on your computer. But it's very simple to go through the database maintenance section to reference where your old data or where your old folders are. So it basically allows you to go through the process of finding those old where those folders have been moved, and then it will hold on to that information and then apply it. Now, if there's missing images and that sort of thing, it'll only apply it to obviously the content of that folder that matches it. But for the most part, it's very simple to go through and sort of like find where those files are and match everything up. So even if you've moved them, you can still go through the process of assigning those values. Obviously, if you want to perfect your database structure, probably don't move too many folders around. Probably just leave it as is, But yeah. Carl asked, when will 2020 be available? Our general release structure is often in the fall. So when we will be releasing the new product in the fall. Yeah. So that's a little bit about databases. So Anita has asked, how can I get ACDSee to upload only new images from a camera card without marking them all individually? I often use camera cards with thousands of photos on them, and it often reads and tags many that I've already uploaded. Okay, so there's a couple answers to this question. So ACDSee works off of your hard drive, right? But if you're using a camera card, you might not have those uploaded or placed within your hard drive yet. They might, in this case, you might just have your camera plugged into your computer and not have a place for those files yet. They still just live on the camera. So, but because ACDSee doesn't necessarily have quote unquote an import function for the software itself, and what I mean by that is you don't need to have to import images every single time you manage them. Like everything you do to an image in ACDSee is working directly off of our hard drive. Like when we look at our folder structure that's on the left here, this is a direct reference of our hard drive. So there's a couple answers to your question. The first one is, well, you can navigate with your folder structure to your camera, right? Okay. And then you can just copy those images from your camera and then make a new folder for them that exists on your hard drive. The other functionality you could do is to just go through the import function right here. And this would be from device. So in this case, your camera. And it will take you like through the process of choosing the files that are on your camera, where you will be placing them on your hard drive, placing them into a new folder and that sort of thing, adding those images to it. So it's not a true import function in that you're importing those images to your ACDSee Photo Studio Ultimate 2018. No. It's just helping you find a location for those images on your hard drive. So hopefully that answers your question. But the fastest way that I think, depending on what your sort of workflow looks like, I would go through the process of just copying all those those images off of your camera in this case, and just finding a home for them by making a new folder. Okay, but the import function does exist to help you with that. Hopefully that answers your question. I'm not really sure what you mean by reads and tags, many that you've already uploaded, but if you already have those images on your hard drive, then there's no necessity to go through that process. Just navigate to them, navigate to the location on your hard drive, and then work off of those files specifically. Okay. Okay, so one of the questions we had earlier, this is going to be going into edit mode. And that question is, how do can you demonstrate a background removal? Can you remove a background entirely? This is a great question with so many answers. So let's illustrate some of them. So let's define the terms, first of all, okay? When we remove a background, my understanding of that would be to make the background functionally transparent. So if I wanted to entirely remove a background here, right, I would get this functionally in the background, right? It wouldn't be a process of making it white or slightly blurring it out. No, they want a complete hard removal of the background. Removing a background is only really doable provided that this is our metrics, provided that this is our definition of a removed background in edit mode, okay? So that's a restriction. So let's talk about that. There's a lot of ways to remove backgrounds. They all are dependent on the media itself. What does your image look like? How is it best to remove the background? Okay? And all of them require selections, meaning that I will have to make an active selection and then make a mask with my selection. That's how I'm going to remove my background. So let's talk about how we make selections. How do those selections impact our layers? And then how do we go about reversing or applying that selection so that there's nothing in our background? Okay, so And I just want to say that I have seen those two questions, but I'll get to them once we're done talking about selections here. Okay, so the selection tools are located at the top left-hand corner in edit mode. So we have the brush selection tool, we have the polygonal selection tool, we have the magic wand selection tool, and we have a couple other selection tools, and we're going to be talking about each one of these and how they can be used to make the selections, where we can remove backgrounds. So the brush selection tool is really cool. So how the brush selection tool works is it basically sees pixel information. I'm going to zoom in on my file here, just so I'm just seeing. That's perfect. So here's my subject, and I want to remove my subject from the background, meaning that I want to just see my subject, no background information whatsoever, okay? If we wanted to select this, we could use the brush selection tool in combination with, I normally set the strength to 100. So what the strength means in this case is when I make this selection, right, that what I'm going to see is not going to have an inherent opacity to it at all. It's just going to be the hard color, okay? This will make more sense once we've made our selection, but just so you understand. The smart brushing is the most important functionality of this. If I turn smart brushing off and I wanted to make a selection, it would not be aware of any of the content that is occurring within the, like, I could just make a really articulate and well-defined selection on my own, but it's not actually giving me any help in this regard. By the way, you can erase selection by right-clicking. So I'm going to do that so I can get a better selection here. So there we go. So I will turn on smart brushing, and I'm going to utilize the magic tool. Magic is a combination of being aware of both colors in pixels and brightness in pixels to make a selection. Okay, so it basically combines both of the two secondary elements into one element. I find it the most useful. I'm also going to I'm probably going to crank my tolerance up. What tolerance means is when you have your tolerance set really high, it cares less about the individual differences between pixels than when it's set really low. You'll notice when I set this to like 15, for example, it's going to be much more particular about what it selects. If we see this selection right here, it has a lot more spots in it in areas where it didn't select anything at all. And that's because it's being far less tolerant of any particular difference in the pixels. Versus if we increase it to its maximum capacity, we might even make more of a selection. Like there might be, if you notice here, it's selecting a little bit of the background that we don't want, in addition to obviously all of my character here. So smart brushing is an incredibly useful tool at making quick, semi-accurate selections, okay? And obviously we can refine these selections at any point. I'm refining these by right-clicking and left-clicking on my subject. You obviously have the ability to change the nib width size and feathering. So nib width is fairly obvious. It just changes the size of the brush. But feathering is a little less obvious. Feathering applies to, if you notice, if you see in the very center of my screen, there's my my wand itself with the brush, and the brush is indicated by that circle, the first inner circle. And on the outside circle is the feathering. Feathering just tapers this, so it means that it's less of a hard change. So let's increase our feathering to just get an example of this. This is a selection with feathering set fairly high, and then we'll make the same selection, but with the feathering set very low. So you'll see that the edges of our without feathering are much more aggressive than the ones with feathering. When I'm making selections, I like to have a little bit of feathering, but not much. And this is just going to actually help, aid rather, in the selection process. So when making brush selections, brush is probably the most overall forgiving selection method. And what I mean by that is it's the one that allows you to probably customize it the most. There are certain images that are more useful for certain selection methods, like I talked about previously. One of those is like when we're making selections, we really want to keep in mind what we're trying to select in this case. So I'm just going to make a deselection here. And if we actually look at our subject here, there's a variety of different methods of selection. We could use the polygonal selection tool, which selects our subject based on, sort of like a set number of points, right? We can make a selection with the magic wand tool, which selects entire bodies of color based on the pixel you've selected. And much like our other tools, it has threshold functionalities, so allow us to select more or less of our image. It's more tolerant or less tolerant of the. This image is an interesting one because there's so much variations of blue that the magic wand tool is really not an ideal tool for making a selection here, right? Because look at that, we have all these different blues that are in our subject. We have also these different blues that are in the water, and on top of that, we have all these blues that are sort of existed within the mountain itself and the sky. So magic wand tool is sort of like, we've already established that it's maybe the worst example. So it's the one we don't want to use, We've already played around a little bit with the brush selection tool itself, but I'm leaning on personally for this image, I think that the best selection method is actually just going to be the polygonal selection tool. And the reason for that being is that we can sort of just go through and we can make a rough selection right next to our subject. Now, where obviously this tool isn't going to be as useful is when our subject has like really curly hair that sort of sticks out, where there's no possible way that we can select that hair quickly and efficiently. Secondarily, obviously the brush tool is probably the second most useful tool here. And I'm just going to make a very quick, brief selection. All selections can be cleaned up in the future, but I'm just going to go through and make this right quickly so we can get a feel for it. Okay, so that's fine. Let's just do this. That's more than enough of an accurate selection of at least the head to work with to begin with. Okay, so I'm going to, there we go, double click, make my selection. So as you can see, there's a bit of an issue up at the top right-hand corner, but for the most part, it's a fairly decent selection. Now, if I wanted to move forward with this selection, right? Okay, this is sort of the subject getting removed from the background. The question being, of course, at the beginning, can you demonstrate a background removal? Well, okay, so there's two ways to do that. I could have selected the background itself, everything but the subject, or I can select just the subject, none of the background. In this case, I've chosen the latter method. I'm going to, after I've made my active selection, which is illustrated by this pink area here, I'm going to make sure my layer 1 is selected, and then I'm going to mask this layer. So I'm going to add a layer mask to this active selection. With that done, I can then deselect my selection, and you'll notice that my subject is now removed from the background, okay? So those are totally separate things. One of the neat things about when you make a mask in ACDSee is the mask exists and is present on the layer 1. So layer 1 here illustrates all of the background is black. If we look at this little thumbnail box right up here, we can see that that area has been turned off, okay? So this mask now reflects the fact that all these other areas are turned off, versus this white area, which is our subject and our selection that we made. These areas are turned on, or in this case, are visible. Now, when we were talking about defining our definitions, right, like setting those definitions at the beginning, we wanted the background to be totally a transparency, which currently is a transparency, right? So all the areas that aren't our subject are now transparent. If I wanted to, at any point, change this, I'm like, okay, actually what I wanted was, I wanted to make a selection of just the background and none of my subject. Well, I could click on the mask at any point and then click the invert button to invert that process. So we'll now see that our subject here is removed for the most part. Obviously, there's areas where this isn't the case, and our background is all visible. Okay, so we can invert those at any process. Now, what's really useful and valuable about masking is provided that my image is selected, the mask specifically is selected, okay? And I have a brush tool or some other fill tool present and active. If I wanted to extend the white space to the visible space, okay? So my brush is currently set on the foreground is set to white. Well, if we reference that white and black, the foreground being white, to our little thumbnail here, if I paint on this image, okay, if I paint white, well, what's going to happen? If I paint white around this area, well, it's probably going to turn it on, right? So if I go through the process of painting on this area, you can see I'm now extending and addressing, you know, the issues that I had with the rest of our image. So if I wanted to fine tune or adjust the edges of my selection, I can do this after I've actually made my mask. Does that make sense? So at any point I can go in and I can go, okay, well, this is great. Now I've got more to work with. I can zoom in way into our subject here and use the reverse, turn it to black to turn off a section, right? And then start painting on that change. And I can sort of fine tune this, and I can right click to paint white and then work on those edges until the selections are accurate. There is very few ways of making like quick, perfect selections. And any of you that are familiar with graphic design and familiar with Photoshop will recognize that selection processes are complicated, and they can be quite difficult. Let's express some situations when we've got more difficult selections to go through. This selection in itself, obviously unhoned, is much easier than other selection processes. So let's take a look at some other images. So let's look at this image, actually. I'm going to discard these changes. Now, there's quite a bit more going on. Actually, you know what? Let's even go to a different image. I want one with really high contrast. Yeah, this is perfect. Let's open and edit mode. So this image, we have our subject once again, and we have our background. This has quite different, quite a different thing going on, in that. So our subject has very high contrast. The background is very white, but there's also this particulate information that's going on with her hair, right? This is where it's going to really add complexity. This is going to make this image hard. Anyone who's ever selected hair knows how difficult this is, right? Look at how many individual strands of hair there are. So if we're going to earnestly tackle this selection, well, we know that the background itself is far less complex than actually our subject is. So when would something like that be, when would, in this case, the brush tool be more useful is exactly in this instance. We know that if we use the brush tool, or sorry, my apologies, not the brush tool, the magic wand tool, that our magic wand selection is going to be much more refined in these areas. Now we've had a couple sections of loss in this image as well, like we've lost the dress, right? So we'd have to go through and make some changes to that. Let's sort of talk about how to use the wand tool. So with the wand selected, just up in our selection area here on our top left, we have 4 tools. The first is to just make a new selection. So if I have this selected and then I click anywhere, it's going to make one selection. If I click on something else that is like the subject's skin, it's going to make a very different selection, okay? So in this case, I'm not adding more to the selection, I'm just swapping back and forth between multiple selections. Add to selection is exactly what I just talked about, in that if we select a different part of our body, in this case the hand, right, that is going to add another component to our selection, and that component in this case was the other brown in her skin, right? An addition of a more brown. So this selection is actually pretty darn good. If we were just to, in this case, make a mask with this selection, Obviously, we're not selecting any of the background white area. We're not selecting any of her dress, so we'd probably have to address this in the mask. But it's a pretty good selection. Her hair looks incredible. Like the little particulate detail in her hair is pretty dead on. So that's exciting. I actually don't want to mess around with this too much. I feel like my threshold set to about the middle here, about around 90, was really useful for collecting as much of this as we can while being a little bit discriminate in our selection. So I'm going to, okay, with that in mind, I'm going to add to layer mask. Now, before I do this, I actually want to make a note, and that is, well, I really like this selection. This is one that's sort of uncommonly good. So I'm going to actually save it. You can save any selection at any point, provided you have an active selection by going to the select and save selection functionality. And I'm just going to name this one. We'll just name it 1. 1 is fine. Actually, let's name it 10 here. I might already have something set to 1. So that selection is now applied, and I can at any point, if I had deselected it, I can reload that selection. Oh, I did have 1, sorry. Yeah, so there's my active selection. So now with this selected, let's go again to our add a layer mask, and let's revisit our selection with it deselected now. Our mask is active. This is pretty good. We know what we can do to this image. It's really just her dress that needs correcting, right? Because it was the white portion that wasn't selected. So if we go into the layer mask 1, and we zoom in a bit, right? We can actually address this issue by just brushing on white in that section. So I'm going to go up to my little brush tool. I'm going to have a look at my brush width. I'm going to increase it a bit here. And then I'm just going to pop the foreground color over to white. And the reason why is because we want to turn on the section of her dress that was turned off. And I'll just go in and re-add that in, right? Pretty simple stuff. And it was all made possible just due to the fact that we have a very different subject here. Our subject is different in the case that our background has more contrast. You know, in this case, the magic wand tool is far, far, far more relevant than using the brush tool and fiddling around with that, or using the polygonal selection, where we definitely can't, just because due to the sheer complexity of her hair. So let's address a third scenario. This is 2. And obviously what we'd really need to do here is just clean up this little section where the white and the dress are sort of meeting. But that's pretty darn good. That's actually an incredible selection. I'm pretty impressed with this. And if we were to apply some sort of background in here, let's do that. Let's get a feel for how accurate this selection was. Really, any selection isn't going to be sort of fully present and visible until you add some sort of hard color to the background. So what I did here is I'm just going to change my foreground color, make a layer 2 that appears beneath the layer, and I'm just going to fill it all up with pink so we can get a feel for our image. You'll notice that there's a bit of fraying on the edge of the hair here, but overall that's a pretty darn good selection. I'd need to select out her shadow or whatever, and maybe I'd address this issue, but overall that's quite good. Now, so the answer to Tom's question, wouldn't it have been easier to use the wand and set to a tolerance of 1 and click on the white background? Well, that's the case if there is only a single color or single brightness in the background. My guess is there was not a single color brightness in this background. My guess is there's actually several different whites going on. Let's test this theory. So if you go to the wand tool and you set the threshold really to 1, earnestly set it to 1, let's see what happens when we select it. So yeah, so there's a lot of different whites going on here. And now this is the case of any sort of photo that you're going to be taking in front of a media wall or media banner where you have a little bit of light play in the image. And yeah, and that's why you're going to see a little bit of a difference there. Versus increasing our threshold, obviously selecting the background, or alternatively inversing that selection and selecting the subject when you have high contrast here. Okay, let's talk about a completely different thing. So far we've talked about easy made selections with brush the brush selection tool and the polygonal selection tool. And we've talked about like high complexity of detail, but very, very high contrast, in that we had basically white with color on the forefront for our main character. But we haven't talked about like a variation of color. And there's two other tools that make very good selections within the ACDSee product, and I want to talk about them. And they're not actually they're not in the selection section. They're in the select dropdown. There are two. There's pixel targeting and luminosity selection. So here's an image where we have a lot of variations of bright colors occurring in the background, and then some pretty hard colors occurring very much near black with the city section here. The city drop down, the boats in the background, that sort of thing. This is a really good example in an image where luminosity selection is going to be pretty good, even though this is a highly complex image and selections are going to be made a bit difficult from it. I'm going to select luminosity selection. You're going to notice that my image goes pink. That's because that's my selection color. Now, if I wanted to select my subject from this, the city section, not the background, I could very easily inverse the selection by going to select and inverse, and then that selects the exact opposite area, which is, of course, my subject in the city and all that, not so much the background that is the sky. If we go through the process of making a mask of the selection, going down to the Add Layer Mask, down to the bottom right-hand corner, and we deselect, you can see that even though that this is such a complicated image and there's so much variation in color going on here, this is a pretty accurate selection as well. And once again, we can go through the process of masking any of these elements out if we're not happy with them. But you know, all things considered, this is a pretty much like a one-click for images that have significant brightness and significant sort of high contrast, but lots of variation in color. Okay, so there's one last selection process, or selection method, and it's my favorite. So let's find an image with a lot of color, a lot of variation in color. Let's see here. Actually, let's do, let's do it this way. Let's do this coast image here. I'm going to open it again in edit mode, and we're going to make a selection based on color. And that and that selection is very easy to do. So I have my layer 1 selected here. I'm going to go to select and pixel targeting. I've talked about pixel targeting in a lot of videos, but it presents to you two different sliders. The first slider is tones, and the second slider is colors. Tones obviously cares about the brightness, and colors obviously care about the hue. If we wanted to make a selection here, and my selection was focused on the water, the fastest way to do so would be to go through the process of selecting these blues, right? So I'm going to obviously reduce all of my tones to 0, my colors to 0, with the exception of the blue, which I'm going to crank, and the sort of dark blue, which I'm also going to increase. Now, if we look at our image here, it's pretty good, the exception of some green bits here, a little bit of the rock that's already targeted as well. So we'd have to go through and clean that up. But we've selected pretty much, everything I intended to. If I go OK, that selection is then added to the active selection, which is again illustrated by the pink. And I can go through the process of adding a layer mask or adding a vibrancy change or whatever you want to do. In this case, I could invert that and it would display that area as an opacity, as a hidden area. Also, what I can do when I have any active selection is go through the process of adding that mask to my selection. So in this case, when I clicked the mask button, it takes that selection and it goes, oh, you want that selection to turn it into a mask? Okay, Adam. And so it did so. But what happens, I also want to maintain that selection in this case, right? If I wanted to keep that selection active, well, I could just always add my mask to my selection, and then it'll actively select whatever the opposite is. In this case, yeah, the background here. So this is really notable when you have a really high color. A great example that I've used in the past is taking sort of pixel targeting specific cars, like maybe even this one here. If you have an image of a car that's a very different color than that of the background, you can go through and you can use the pixel targeting tool to sort of select individual components. I think this one, there's going to be a lot of red in the background. So you need to go through and you need to clean it up a little bit, but mostly the most red thing in this entire photo is, of course, this red beetle here. So I can go through and I can make like a vibrancy change on pretty much just the beetle. Again, I would have to go through and I'd have to clean up little areas of the background, but overall, it's a pretty good saturation application to just the subject here, which is the red beetle, with a couple elements that we need to change in the background. I could also just change the color of the beetle altogether. So pixel targeting, really useful for when you're targeting specific colors or tones, and versus luminosity selection is really great when you have like images that have incredible detail, but hard lights and hard darks, so that you can select, in this case, just the brights, or inverse it to select just the darks. So that is a very long answer to one of the most common questions I have, which is how do you make good selections, basically. And what this person was asking is, how do you demonstrate a background removal? Well, there's a lot of different ways you can do that. And obviously the main way is to go through the process of making selections. So there's your sort of crash course on selections. Okay, I promised I'd answer some of these other questions that popped up, so let's do this. Okay, Carl asks, let's say I have a new project and I want new folder structures to be managed without containing the original file structure. In other words, how do I unmanage one and manage only the new and have only the set of folders show up in the folders area? I don't think ACDSee can do that. And the reason why is because, like, again, what is the purpose of the program? The purpose of the program is it's a file management and editing software that works off of your hard drive. If you have two identical folders, one of which that you care about, one of which that you don't care about, but both exist on your hard drive, well, then ACDSee cares about both of those. There might be ways to sort of eliminate specific folder structures from your from sort of the what you display thumbnail wise and all of these things. But as far as I'm concerned, I'm unaware of it. Now, this is a great question, and unfortunately, I don't have a specific answer for this question. My gut instinct is that it's not possible, but I would ask you, Carl, to personally send me an email, and I will ask the developers to find out for you, or I will get a better answer for you. But it's a good question, okay? Peter Archdale, my apologies, Peter, has asked, any sign of focus stacking feature in ACDSee Ultimate 2020? I can't spoil any of the new features that are coming out in ACDSee 2020. However, there are many excellent features that are coming out in the next series, and I'm very excited to talk about them, but I can't spoil anything. So my apologies. John asked, can I copy my database and pics to a portable drive? Okay. Work on the images, then copy back. For example, I say I want to continue editing my pics while I'm traveling and therefore away. Continuing my pics while I'm traveling and therefore away from my desktop. Could I copy the entire folder of pics database to a portable drive? Yeah, I don't see why not. I mean, a database is a file, so it's like just save the file on your computer, copy the database file to your laptop, provided you have the same access to the same folder structures on your laptop as that you do of your images on your computer. Then you're gravy, my friend. You would have to go through the process of obviously loading that database. Secondarily, I would also you would have to work off of the database. You'd have to need the same version. So provided if you have an older version on your laptop and a newer version on your computer, you would have to either, you'd have to install the newer version on your laptop in order for you to access the database from the newer version. So there's no cross conversion when it comes to an older version of ACDSee can't run a newer version of ACDSee's database. However, a newer version of ACDSee can run a database of an older version by going through the database wizard, okay? And importing after you've gone through the conversion process. So short answer, absolutely. Database is a file. A file can be referenced in anything. You just need to make sure you have the same folder structure, which would mean that you have an external hard drive in your gravy. Yeah. Okie doke. Good, some good questions there. Okay, so I had another question. That question was, how do you create a watermark? This is an awesome question. ACDSee is not ideal for for creating a watermark. This is also different from using a watermark. Obviously in ACDSee, if I wanted to use a watermark at any point, I would just open up an image in edit mode, go to my watermark function, and it would go through the process of adding a watermark to my image. In this case, my watermark is an entire image, but I don't want that. I would just want like a picture of my logo or something like that. So let's make one. Let's go to let's create a new image. Let's create a logo file in ACDSee. Again, this isn't really a logo creation software, but we can hash one out here. We can sort of create something that works for a watermark. So I'm going to create a new image. I'm going to name it my watermark file. Okay. I'm going to make the pixel size 1000 by 1000. And then I'm going to change, this is very important, the background content to transparent. Okay. I'm going to hit OK. It's going to create me a new file. There it is. Boom. 1000 by 1000 pixels. Watermark. Awesome. Let's make this. So I'm going to add a border to my watermark. Let's do it. Let's make a little border. What I'm going to do is I'm literally just going to add a box. And let's make it the edge quite thick. Okay. Fill this section. And then let's add some text. And I'll change it to a name. So let's go Ian Anderson. And let's reduce the size and change the text and remove any effects from the text. So I'm just going to make this text. Let's do what we got here that doesn't look terrible. Montserrat, and let's increase the size, or rather, let's do that. And I'm just going to move this to the left here. So Ian Anderson, very rough, very rudimentary. He has a logo. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through the process of saving this as a PNG. So if I save this as a PNG, I'll go to File, Save As, and I'll save this watermark file as a PNG. The reason why I'm saving this as a PNG is because PNGs maintain transparency versus JPEGs will give you a hard white background in areas where transparencies existed. So I will save watermark file.png in my photos folder. Yes is fine to that. And then, provided I have a photo actually active, I can go to the watermark section, browse for an image. I'm going to browse for my watermark, which is watermark file. Oh, There we go. Open that. I want to maintain the aspect ratio or resizing because I want this to be quite small. So when you maintain the aspect ratio, it means that it's going to hold the width and height, so that it's always the equivalent value to that you started with. It's not going to warp the image. So I'll place Ian Anderson's watermark just down in the bottom right-hand corner here. That looks pretty good. I'm going to apply a blend effect to it. We'll make it an overlay effect so that and the opacity is maximized so that you can still see the watermark. It's very clearly watermarked, but there's no necessary reason that it's overly black or anything like that. So that was a super quick process. The main important functionality there is obviously that you just save your image as a PNG so you can maintain transparency. And then you can navigate to that watermark file at any point in the future. I'll just click done when I'm finished placing my watermark. And yeah, there you go. There you have it. Ian Anderson's photography watermark. One quick note, when you go to make a watermark, if you want to edit the photo in the future in edit mode and maintain like layer functionality, just make sure that when you click on the watermark section, that you add watermark as a new layer. And what that will do is instead of flattening the image right here, well, as we have done on layer 1, the watermark and layer 1 are together, it will just add it as a secondary layer so that you can sort of move and add and change as you see fit. So it just allows you to maintain non-destructiveness. Cool. That is my watermark process. Okay, we've already covered turning off names and facial recognition. Oh, this was a question I get very regularly. It's a really silly one, but that's just how do you change the aesthetic of your GUI? And what I think this person means by this is historically in the past, ACDSee has had a white color scheme versus a black color scheme, which is more commonly adopted very recently within the last couple of years. The white color scheme you can get by going to Tools and Options, just going to Manage Mode and just changing the display theme to light. So if you go like that and you hit OK, it will change the display theme back to its original display theme, which I think was the case until 2017. Pardon me. So yeah, so that just changes. I prefer the charcoal color scheme personally, but there's lots of people that prefer the different ones. So yeah, so you can do that by the, in that quickly and efficiently within Manage Mode. Obviously, when you change it within the options, the next time you open the software, it will be whatever you last changed the settings to. That's kind of a funky little thing. Importantly, you know, the other thing that's we don't really talk about too much is obviously the ability to change workspace layouts. So when this person asked, like, how do I change the aesthetic look of the graphic user interface, I think they were thinking about more the colors in this case. But you can use the workspace function within Manage Mode to change the way your panels are set up. So if I wanted to move my organization panels on the right here underneath my folder structure, so that if I wanted to change the sort of visual appearance of my GUI, which I do regularly, I can go about to the workspaces and then manage workspaces to save a new one. So I could save this workspace as right align, and this would allow me to, it's been saved, and I can reference this workspace in the past. You can also go to your default workspace, which is the one that is the factory default in this case at any point by going to that. And then one more note in regards to GUI is you can hide panels. So if you ever at any point wanted to hide the properties panel or the folder tree panel, you know, depending on where it's placed in the GUI, you can use these buttons at the top right-hand corner to hide left panels, hide bottom panels, and hide right panels. The GUI is very functional. Like anything that sits as that is docked within it can be moved around. Like you have a lot of variation here. So yeah, it's awesome. In fact, actually the GUI can be really simplified, dramatically simplified in the product. So yeah. So a couple different methods of changing the GUI structure. Dave asked, does the software have its own copyright symbols to use? I believe it uses the active versions logo when you go into watermarks. So if you're using Ultimate Pro or Standard, it should have like a little icon there for you. Now, I believe these exist within the sort of the folder structure of wherever you saved ACDSee on your computer. But as soon as you change the watermark, it's just going to reference that one until you add another one or browse to a different one. So I think when you originally start the product, the default watermark will always be that of the products. So it'll be that little ACDSee icon. Yeah. Tom Pickering asks, is there a way to edit a mask directly, such as with levels or curves adjustments? Yeah, great question. Edit a mask with curves. Okay, so when you add, when you're in edit mode, okay, whenever we're talking about masking, we're talking about edit mode, okay? Curves. So if I add a curves, okay, curves is my adjustment layer that pops up. Now, I can adjust this functionality for this adjustment layer just within the bottom section right here that pops up. So if I wanted to, you know, really sort of enhance the top sort of vibrance of this image, if I wanted to sort of match the curve of my image here, there we go. Okay, if I wanted to do that, there we go. Yeah. Okay, so that's being applied to my whole image currently, obviously, right? So this is, again, if we're referencing masking, the white box means it's on. If we look at the curves, well, we can tell that that mask is being applied to our whole image as the whole image is represented in this white little thumbnail box, okay? If I click away from this, I click on our layer 1 or something like that, I move away from it. I can get back to this curve at any point by clicking on the box itself. Now, you can sort of at any point take this mask, right? Use a black brush to hide that effect in some areas of your image. So if you wanted that curve adjustment to just be applied to the sky and not any of these buildings, you could go through the process of just brushing it off for those sections, right? So if we're taking a look at our sort of like our preview mask then, well, where is that effect being applied? Where is this curves effect being applied? Well, the curves effect is being applied to the sky. We know the sky, it's the sky because it's white. It is active. It is on. And the curves adjustment is turned off for the section that is the sort of the trees and the palms and the sand and etc. So you can edit a mask directly on any adjustment layer, or when you go through the process of making a selection or you mask another layer, you can sort of hide or unhide it. But for the purpose of any of these adjustment layers, they come already embedded with a mask on them that allows you to edit them. Editing the mask is in a simple process, just done through, going through using the brush tool. Okay, so Tom responds to that question. I'm not asking about masking an adjustment layer, but adjusting a mask with levels or curves. Adjusting the mask itself. Okay, adjusting the mask itself. Can you adjust the mask on its own? I think it'll make a reselection of it if you do luminosity. Well, let's try it. I believe, okay, so a luminosity selection on the curves adjustment. I'm just not sure if this is going to make any change to the mask. I know that, like, from a fundamental level, the things you can do to masks are obviously reduce the opacity or change the blend mode of them. That you can 100% do to a curve regardless of whether or not it is. But adding a luminosity selection to a mask. So if I've done this, well, how would I go about brushing it on? Do I brush it on like this? No. I'm not sure if you can apply it. Well, let's here. Select. I'm not sure if there's a fast way to answer, or I don't believe that's possible within the product. But I'm also not necessarily sure I'm fully understanding your question. So Tom, what I might ask you to do is email me and I can double check with the developers. As always, they're kind of my resource when I don't fully understand how to do something either. But my gut instinct is I don't think you can adjust a mask itself, the mask with another adjustment. Yeah. It's possible, however, you can, let me think here. It's possible you can, it is possible you can, let's see here, do this. I wonder if you can, because you can, I believe, can you make a mask, white balance affects only the layer below it? Yeah, no, it only cares. Okay, so my gut reaction to that would be to add another sort of adjustment layer and then clip to the layer beneath it. But clipping, in this case, cares about the base layer, layer 1, not the adjustment layer. So that's not possible. You might not understand that interaction that I've just explained, but clipping is something that I would like for them to make clipping apply adjustment layer to adjustment layer, but I don't believe that is the way it works yet. So anyway, long story short, Tom, I'm not sure if I fully understand the question. Hopefully I've at least answered it to some degree, but please shoot me an email, and if I don't know the answer, I will find out the answer, okay? So aprice@ACDSystems is my email. Okay. Peter asks a suggestion. I'm a member of a couple of Facebook groups which are dedicated to Olympus cameras, and I find them really useful for getting answers to any questions that I have. Much better than a thread-based system such as ACDSee users. Any thoughts about setting up such a group for ACDSee? Well, we don't have it for specific camera models right now, although I think we do have a forum. Like, obviously we have a forum on our website, and we have a whole community section that I would suggest checking out. But your real question is, okay, if you're using ACDSee and you're using the forum, well, it gives you the ability to start like an Olympus camera users forum subsection for ACDSee. Oh, you do mean about it. Okay, well then, yeah, please check out our forum. Yeah, it's on our, I'll find you the section on the website. It is right there. Community. Oh, okay. Well, then I don't believe there's currently a sort of a subsection, a community for what you're asking for. Really, the two things I can point to you that are sort of community oriented is, of course, our community page on our website, and then obviously secondarily is the forum. There is a possibility that there are other communities online that deal with ACDSee regularly, but I'm just not aware of what websites those are. So yeah. Okay, so okay, we already talked about converting databases. We've already talked about that. Right, one other question that I get regularly as well, which is that of adding IPTC data to multiple images. The IPTC data is, I'm just gonna, actually, let's go back into my other folder here, my face detection folder, and just select every single photo in the folder. If I wanted to make a batch change to the IPTC data of these images, it's very simple. It works just like how you'd change it for one image. And that is, you would go to the properties panel, and then you would go to the IPTC, and with all of those images selected, you would change a value. So if I wanted to change this country value to Canada, it's going to apply that metadata change to every single image. Yeah, I agree, Peter. For those sort of things, you obviously want like a dedicated space. Like I'm sort of involved with a lot of different small communities, including my own like cycling community in my city, and it's like you really just need to have like a good dedicated group of people already, and then on top of that, like people that are sort of committed around the clock to administrating those sections. Just because you'll have people that are not necessarily nice, or people that you want to be able to make sure the conversation is always steered in the right direction. But you know what? I also don't know. Maybe there's one online. But shoot me an email. I can answer. Mark, our head developer, is probably the most deeply entrenched in the ACDSee world in terms of what people are saying about and talking about the product. So it's possible that there is a really good. I mean, maybe there's one on like a pre-existing photography website. But anyway, it's something I'd have to look into. So shoot me an email, I'll answer your question. I'll just talk to Mark. He'll be the one who knows. So, okay, so we just sort of quickly illustrated how to batch edit IPTC information, and it always just comes down to just selecting a folder, selecting how many images you want, and going in and changing the information there. I would suggest, just because you'd have to, if you wanted to change the IPTC data of multiple images across across different folders, I would suggest making some sort of rating, category, tag functionality that you can pull them together in the catalog in order to do that. Just because otherwise you'd be going to the location of different folders and then setting those images to the corresponding IPTC data. But for the most part, it is possible to obviously change vast swaths of images IPTC metadata in a simple click, provided they're in the same location. So, okay, the question I also get quite regularly, I think this will be my last question for this evening, or sorry, for today, and that is the difference between vibrance and saturation. Now, there's probably a lot of you that are experienced photographers already in this, and so this will become as a no-brainer to you. But I'm going to use a really good example of an image here. This is exactly it. So in ACDSee, vibrance and saturation are both found within the vibrance section here as an adjustment layer, or you could click on the color EQ panel to get to the color vibrance and adjustments through that. But we'll just use the adjustment layers because it's fastest. So saturation is a universal application change to an image. So if I was to just crank the saturation on this image, you'll see that it really posterizes my image, especially when it comes to the face. But elements that were maybe intended to be saturated, like for example, her coat here, we have a lot of problems in regards to the skin. Saturation across the board will increase R, G, and B. Vibrance, however, impacts an image quite differently. When you increase a vibrance, I've got my vibrance cranked here. One of the things that vibrance is a bit more selective about is the R portion of the RGB in terms of the way that it's presented to the viewer. And the reason why this is because vibrance is much more useful for when you have a photo that contains a subject, especially when it comes down to skin. So when we changed our saturation, we got a universal application of changes to RGB to our image. And that's why it changed our skin to such an orange, gross, posterized color. But vibrance doesn't change the skin color, or it does its best to not impact elements that are already somewhat saturated. So in this case, it's sort of focusing more on other colors that are within this image than the actual than in this case the face. Most users who are sort of wanting to go through the process of changing the colors of their image, especially when it comes to when you're working with subjects like our subject here, you probably want to use a combination of both vibrance and saturation to get the fully intended effect. But just know that vibrance on its own will do the best to automatically preconceive what elements of your image look like or could be interpreted as already saturated. In the case of skin is already saturated. So, my friends, it's been an hour and a half. We're done. Thank you so much for participating. Please, if you have any more questions, there's probably some questions that I was not able to get to today. Please email me. Once again, my email is in the chat section, so if you can't see it, just pull up the chat. And chat to all the attendees. It's aprice@acdsystems.com. I'd like to hear from you. And if there's, like I said, if there's any questions that I don't know the answers to, I often get Mark or some of the other developers involved in my questions. And I'll get back to you as soon as possible. It's also, in regards to one of the nice things is it's a lot faster than going through support or something like that. If you have some more, more intense questions in regards to use, or maybe even examples of certain bugs and that sort of thing. But I'd just like to thank you because I appreciate everyone stopping by for the workshop. This is the second in the series of the ACDSee question series. So common questions. You can find this in a couple days. I'll be uploading it to YouTube as I do all of the workshops. I guess I'll also just read, just in case some of you missed it. That is our YouTube channel. That's where I put all the workshops. There's a playlist for our workshop series. So check that out if you want to watch any previous workshops. And just also in response to a previous question we had, please, if you want to check out a better understanding of workflow, I would really highly recommend you check out Alec Watson's series on workflow. It's awesome. Yeah, anyway, I'm going to grab some lunch. Thank you, everybody, for participating. And I appreciate it. We'll be doing another one next month, as always. It's always around the middle of the month on a Wednesday at 1 o'clock Pacific time. Thank you so much.